Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is all about the truth about my giant TBR. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And if you are new here, I have a giant physical TBR of over 170 books. And I've been working on getting that number down, believe it or not. But today, some home truths. I need to be honest with myself. I need to be honest with everyone. It's going to be a chatty video, but it's also going to be a bit of a numbers video. First of all, in case you are new or don't know how I calculate the numbers of my giant TBR, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk numbers. If I was working really hard on reducing my giant physical TBR all year last year, why did my overarching number only go down by 15 books? That's what we're going to be looking at. So first of all, a word on how I calculate the giant TBR numbers. So, ever since starting my BookTube channel, I've always been sharing the number of books that I have. And ever since the first video I made that contained my entire physical TBR, I've had a pretty good handle on the exact numbers. So at the end of 2022, my number was standing at 177 books. The problem being that I had actually started the year on 192 books. So if I read a book from the giant TBR every single week last year, why did my number only go down by 15? Well, of course, this is partly answered by book hauling, but also you just know that my friend the library was extremely responsible. So we're going to look at those numbers in a minute. So calculating my number, I talk about my numbers every month at the end of my wrap-up video because that seems like the best way to manage it. So I only calculate it once a month. I take the number from the previous wrap-up video, and the first thing I do is add on any books that I have bought and not read during that month. So if I buy a book and I read it all within the same month, that book does not add to the giant TBR. It also doesn't take away from the giant TBR. If I buy a book in a month and I haven't read it by the end of the month, I add that book onto the giant TBR numbers. After I've done that, I take away any books that I have read. So if I've read any, if I've DNF'd any, if I have unhauled any without reading them, all of these numbers come off the giant TBR number. So that's how I work it out, and I do that once a month. How then did I end up with this situation where the TBR hasn't actually gone down that much? I'll show you here a graph of the TBR by month. You can see I started at 192 and things went down very slowly. This is because of hauling books primarily. And you can see that some months the numbers did actually go up, such as June when it was my birthday and there was a big book haul. It also went up at the end of the year in December because of Christmas, largely. That's the graph. The number of books that I read in 2022 was 177 books as well. So my TBR stands at 177 and I read 177. So why didn't the TBR go down that much? Let's have a look at some numbers. So in order to work out the numbers for this video, I sorted all of the books that I read into categories. So there was books that I owned before 2022. So the true giant TBR books that were on the giant TBR at the beginning of the year. I also had a category, books that I hauled and read during the year. Of course, there were some books that I hauled and didn't read during the year, so they are now on the giant TBR numbers. There were also 2 free ebooks that I read that were really old books, so they were available online. There were audiobooks that I read from my audiobook subscription. There were library books, in which number I included any ebooks or audiobooks I read on Libby or BorrowBox. There were rereads, and there were books that I borrowed from my mum. It turned out that there were 6 books on my list of books I read this year that I read in a certain format and then later purchased a physical copy. Those books I've counted in their original form. So if I read them from the library and then bought myself a copy, I've counted it as a library book for the sake of the numbers adding up. It's time to shame myself with these numbers, because how did I read 177 books and DNF 7 and still only have the giant TBR go down by 15? It shouldn't be possible, but it is. So here's what happened. I owned 42 of the books that I read at the beginning of 2022. Not as many as I hoped, but this is the number that I get if I don't factor in all of the books that got added to the giant TBR along the way each month. Yeah, 2 of those were actually in bigger collections. So one was in my Oscar Wilde book that I have here, and one was in my Shakespeare collection. So I've counted those as books that I already owned. Let's save the books that I hauled and the library books for last. So there were 2 free ebooks that I read online. There were 19 audiobooks from my audiobook subscription. I borrowed 3 books from my mum, and 11 books that I read last year were rereads. Now for the shameful numbers. I actually hauled and read 50 books last year. Now I don't think this is too bad, because I did read all of these. So that proves that I was buying books that I wanted to read and reading them, which is great. There is also the number that obviously doesn't go into these numbers of books read. I hauled 38 books, including gifts, that I did not read yet. So they obviously all made the TBR bigger. And my final number, which I think really contributed to my shelves remaining so large in 2022, I actually borrowed from the library, including ebooks and audiobooks in the Libby app and the BorrowBox app, 56 library books. So those are my numbers. If I add those 3 books that I borrowed from my mum to all the books that were borrowed from the library, the Libby app and BorrowBox, that gives us a percentage. 33% of the books that I read last year were borrowed. 25% of the books were hauled during the course of the year. 24% were already on the TBR at the start of the year. 11% were audiobooks. 6% were rereads, and that 1% covers the random bits of percentages and the 2 ebooks. And if I've done my maths right, which is highly unlikely, but let's hope, that is what happened on the TBR last year. So if you've watched my December TBR, found out my final TBR number and thought, wow, 15 books taken off the giant TBR, that's not that many. That's why. Because I've been using the library, I've been hauling books, and therefore the giant TBR stayed pretty similar this year. But the important thing was I was working on it. And the even more important thing is I am working on it even harder now with my 30 book challenge. I am trying to read 30 books that I own before I buy any new books. I'm also limiting myself to trying to only borrow 1 book from my mum every month and 1 book maximum from the library each month until I've completed those 30 books. And fingers crossed, my stats will look a lot better next year. We can hope. I hope you've enjoyed this video today, and if you have, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and please do leave me a comment. Do you read most of your books from the library? Are most of them books that you already own? Or are you buying a book and reading a book? I would love to know what your reading habits are. I was quite surprised to learn just how many books I was getting from the library. Thanks for watching today, and I do hope that you will join me again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.